Mr. Mark O'Reilly. Welcome to the podcast. I tried to get you on this show 5 years ago, and it never happened. Were you just waiting until I became really famous? Because it still hasn't happened yet, but for some reason we have you in the room here now today.
I was going to say, I was delighted to get the invite, and 5 years on, I'm delighted to be sitting in the room with you.
I think it's going to be a very different conversation than it would have been 5 years ago. For several reasons. First of all, from my perspective, 5 years of running my business, fundamental shifts and changes in me as a person. So the conversations I have now, I know are really different, but also in you, because you've been on a journey the last 5 years too. That's different because I came across you first under the umbrella of Fit Vision. And a lot of it was, I wanted to understand more about that wellness space in the corporate world, because I'm fascinated sometimes by the corporate space. I've never operated there, but most of my friends do. And a lot of the conversations I would have had in the medical industry were with people who worked in these corporate style jobs. It was high pace, high octane, a lot of stress. So I was fascinated by it. And your approach to that, trying to bring in the balance, the fitness, the wellness, the mindset, was fascinating to me. But it's even deeper, as we now know. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit about what it is you do from a coaching perspective now? And we'll maybe flesh out some of those terms then.
Yeah, I think maybe as well, to bring us back to around that time where we would have initially interacted with one another, probably not too dissimilar to many of your listeners. I had a very clear strategy, path, set of goals that was completely then derailed by COVID. What COVID did for me, as again for many others I'm sure, I reassessed everything. I had a business which primarily offered on-site services. As you can imagine, overnight, 90% of our business that we'd built up for 8 years completely wiped out, with no indication when it was going to come back on stream. Now, at that time, I was a qualified coach. I was coaching individuals. But it got me thinking about the level of quality I could provide to people that I coach. I really started to reflect on that. And what's always, I suppose, motivated me to do what we do in Fit Vision is this idea of an individual's performance. How can we help them perform better in that corporate setting? And as we know, there's many elements to that. So that set me on a pathway where very soon I will finish my third master's in 5 years. Those masters have been in the areas of mental health and mental skills, organisational psychology, and I'm about to finish one now in psychology. And the reason I'm telling you that is, from a coaching perspective, if I'm working with somebody, yes, it's important to have the coaching qualifications and do let's say, the fundamentals of a good quality coach. But when I'm working with somebody, the lens that I'm looking at that individual through is 12 years as a business owner. It's the various academic journey that I've been on. And I think that's really important, because as much as coaching is extremely valuable, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that, I think the type of coach that you work with is very important. And it's not uncommon for me to sit with somebody and say to them, I'm not the right coach for you. You know, I might have someone I can recommend to you, but I'm not the right coach for you. Whereas I'll also sit with people because I know that they're my ideal client, and I'll be extremely confident that I can help that person. Now, if we think about the value in coaching, like many of your listeners, I'm also thinking, what's the outcome? What's the value I'm going to get from engaging in this service? And the best way I can describe coaching, and when people think of coaching, they might be thinking sports coaching, right? It's quite different. When I'm thinking of coaching from an executive coaching perspective, it's all around strategy. So we all have goals we want to achieve. The coach can help you build an effective strategy. And strategy in its most simplest terms is, where am I now? Where do I want to go? How am I going to get there? In the where am I now piece, the coach can create a safe environment for the individual to reflect. Ultimately, because in that phase, there's going to be things that are difficult for you to explore. You need to be doing that with somebody who can showcase that support, but also showcase the right level of challenge. There's then the where do I want to go? So clarity on the goals. Again, not uncommon for people to have goals which have been essentially created by external factors, other people, friends. You see friends do something, you think, yeah, I'm going to do that too. Doesn't really align with me, but you know what? It looks good externally. Now, the challenge with that is, as you meet roadblocks and challenges and barriers, you won't overcome those because that goal doesn't really align with you, doesn't align with your core. It's not going to fulfill you. A good coach is going to help you set a goal which is based around your definition of success, which is extremely important. And then there's the piece in the middle. How am I going to get there? Again, speaking back to what I mentioned previously, my lens looks at a couple of different things. So how I'm going to help whoever the person I'm coaching get there, I bring a lot of that into that part of it. That's where we talk tactics. That's where we're going to really uncover what are the tactics that are going to get you closer and close that gap between where you are now and where you want to go. And again, that highlights the importance of picking the right coach for you.
Very, very nice. Okay. As you're speaking there, I am putting myself into shoes I used to wear and shoes of a lot of people I speak to when they hear the word coach. You've given us a really nice outline of the work that you do. And that, from my understanding now, is probably what can and should be transposed onto a coach no matter where they are. So even in a sport, because I said to you when we spoke earlier in the week about when a lot of us hear coach, we think sport immediately. And I was like, that's a different thing. And then where I actually broke it down, it's actually exactly the same thing. The idea is for someone to come in and help you identify what your goal is and then facilitate you getting there and put a set of tactics in place to actually action on that. And at no point in that are they coming in to tell you what to do. But I'm used to being coached, quote unquote, in a sporting context by someone who comes to tell me what to do. And I have developed a dependency on being told what to do. And I have not developed an ability to critically analyze and to figure out what it is that I want and to put in place something that I feel ownership of, because that's just not what I'm used to. So I think for a lot of us, especially if we've been involved in organized sports, or even when you do go to school and you're doing sports and there's a coach there, and it's all under that same context. So when we do get into this space of, and I don't want this to be dominated by business owners, but we're going to talk a lot about business owners, but anybody who is looking to improve or develop any aspect of their life, because we do have this bracket called life coaching now as well, which is very broad, which we'll discuss as well. And we have obviously the sporting environment, which people are involved in. We have the business environment. We have the relationship environment, relationship coaches, dating coaches. There's coaches for everything. Yeah. But really, if we look at the definition you've given us there, that technically applies across the board. So you're looking for this certain skill set, this ability to interface with you where you're at, and someone who can help you and facilitate you to reach a specific goal. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And just to what you're saying there, if we are considering what you've just said, it's this idea of being able to build somebody else up, right? So from a sporting context, if I'm a manager or I'm a coach, is it really beneficial for me to be constantly telling the players what to do? I may think that's where my value comes from. That's how I quantify my value. I tell you what to do when you go out on the pitch. But then what happens when something goes wrong on the pitch? Are they looking to the sideline to see, hey, coach, what should I do now? No, generally they're trying to figure it out. So the muscle that we should be really trying to work for those players is decision-making under pressure, critical thinking. And again, that applies in a business context. If I own a business, if I'm a manager, if I'm a leader, yes, I may get a lot of my value from being the one who solves the problem. But eventually you're going to reach a point in your career where you're not paid for solving the problems. You're paid for actually getting other people to solve the problems. So no longer is it your technical ability or your level of control that matters. It's your level of influence that matters. It's about being a key influencer. And that's where coaching can be extremely beneficial to a manager, a leader, a sports coach, you name it. Those coaching principles translate to being an effective influencer. And I always say that our success is really dependent on our ability to get what's in our heart and mind into the hearts and minds of those who most influence our success.
Okay. that went an extra level than I thought it was going to go there. So can you say that again for me? Our
success.
So my success depends on my ability to get what I want most effectively into your head so you can then help me achieve that.
100%. And that's relevant for a business owner.
Coaching inception here.
Sports coach.
Yeah.
Manager. Someone who's a manager in McDonald's, right? Ultimately, their life's going to be a hell of a lot easier if they can translate to the people who are flipping the burgers, who are doing the, drive-through.
Yeah.
Getting them to buy in ultimately.
Yeah, I'm even thinking, like, even in relationship terms, if I can effectively communicate to you what it is that I want, there are certain elements of what you're going to do that are going to influence how I get there or how our relationship grows. So the better I am at communicating that and expressing that, and to go a step back further, the better I am at actually identifying what that is within me and developing that skill set, the better I'm going to be able to communicate it to you, the more you'll be able to understand and then be able to help and facilitate me, and vice versa. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to frame that.
And I know, by the way, Dan, you discuss this topic quite a bit on your podcasts. But if I was to say to you, based on all your experience and guests you've interviewed, how challenging is it for us to do personally what you've just described? Understand our wants, our needs.
Yeah. That's always, I know you listen to, actually, for full clarity here, I should actually say that I do work with you. You do coach me. Can I call you my coach? Is that
you can?
Is that a thing? Yeah. So Mark is actually my coach. I'm going through a coaching process at Mark at the moment, just for full transparency on that. And to answer your question, as well, because you do listen to some of the episodes, it's probably something that comes up 80 to 90% of the conversations. I think it's a fundamental piece of our journey as human beings, giving ourselves that, and here's the word, here it comes, people, space, giving ourselves the space, the time and space to really understand what it is that we want. If we're talking about the meaning or the happiness or whatever you want to put, whatever words you want to use, I do think that a missing skill that lots of us have is an ability to really dive in and understand what is it that I want as Dan. Like, what is this idea of happiness? What is going to make me feel at peace and content and connected and all of these fundamental human needs? What is that? Not understanding that, for me, it limits all of the other tools I have access to. It makes them kind of empty. I talked to you before about like self-help and this idea of overstimulating ourselves and the cathartic release of reading a personal development book or a business book or listening to a podcast or attending a seminar. If I don't actually know what I want, they're all empty tools, because I can do the things and probably will never actually, unless it's by luck, reach this state that I desire.
Yeah.
And from speaking to people who are much further along than me, whether that's with their business or their life or their finances or their wealth, whatever it might be, that these metrics we use for success, they say the same thing. It doesn't mean anything without the deeper meaning. And the deeper meaning, they were looking to attach the money or the success of the car to that.
Yeah.
And they can be mutually exclusive. You can have the success and the wealth and also the happiness. You can have none of the success and the wealth and also the happiness, and you can have the success and the wealth and none of the happiness. I said that twice, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Well, what's coming up for me as you're speaking as well is, I've engaged with a lot of individuals. So when I started my career and my business, I was a personal trainer. And for me, that was an incredible couple of years, because I used to get 8 one-to-one opportunities because I was based in a quite an affluent area in Dublin, as in where my studio was. I had clients that were executives. I got 8 sessions a day where I could pick the brain of these individuals. One of the most common trends that I saw come, and I always say that there's certain things you'll pick up off people you interact with, and there's also certain things that you'll say, oh, I'm very aware that I don't necessarily want to take on that trait or take on that characteristic, right? One common theme was this idea of it was never enough. It's never enough. It's always the next thing. It's always the next thing. These individuals, their health was quite poor, right? Hence why they were coming to me to try and get a handle on that. Some of them, no real relationships with family members. Their whole identity was attached to progressing in the business. That was the idea. It was continuously progressing in the business. Now, if I said to you, how much work do you think they did on actually what we're talking about here, taking a step back, finding out, why is it that I'm maybe driving as hard as I'm driving? Why is it that I'm willing to sacrifice my health, my relationships with my family? Because if you ask them the question why they're doing what they're doing, they would generally say it was for their family, right? Create a better life, etc. So it's quite interesting how even these people who are extremely competent in what they do can fall into this trap as well. They're just not carving out, as you said, not carving out the space, right? But also carving out the space is challenging. It's difficult. You've got to be honest. If you really want to get the value in that work, you've got to be honest. And there's pieces you're going to have to accept. You're going to have to accept some of your flaws because we're all flawed. That's tough. That's challenging. That's going to create a sense of unease. Don't like to do that.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's so much resistance to that? Conscious and unconscious resistance to looking inwards. I have lots of theories, but you've have so much experience with so many people who are in this specific category. Why do you feel that is?
For me, and again, I could give a couple of different theories, right? But based on my experience, knowing that we are biopsychosocial creatures, I think we are extremely driven and dictated by our social environments. So I see Dan do something, people give him likes on Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever it might be. People speak highly of Dan. I should follow and do what Dan does. So I'm not in that moment, I'm not considering what is it that I really want. I'm considering, okay, that looks good. I should do that. And by the way, I hit a point when I was running the business. So I started the business when I was 23, 24, right? Very young. And again, meeting 8 of these people every day, really impressed. My definition of success became their definition of success because I would naturally ask them, what do you think I should do? And I remember probably about 4 years in, I was living on my own at the time. I'd lost a lot of good quality relationships with friends, right? As I was trying to scale this business. And I remember just being completely and utterly burnt out. Now that I look back and I understand that burnout is categorized by emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment, I can say that I was burnt out. I was thinking, why am I doing this anymore? Like, why don't I just give it up, right? The lens I was ultimately looking through and measuring my success was the lens of the people I was interacting with, delivering personal training to, and what they thought I should be trying to achieve. At no point did I accept the fact that my definition of success might not sound as amazing as theirs, but it's my definition of success. I don't want to scale and sell the business. I will work in this business till the day I die because I love what I do. They want to sell businesses after 5 years. That's not saying that's wrong or what I'm doing is wrong, but it's what I want. Yeah. It's what they want. Well, I hope it's what they want, right? And the quicker we can get to that point of accepting what we want, there's a lot of freedom in that forest. There's a lot of motivation. There's a lot of energy. And then I think there's a lot of acceptance then around the fact that, yeah, it's okay to maybe want something which in someone else's eyes isn't the most amazing, ambitious, or as we say, it's not a big, hairy, audacious goal in their eyes, but it might be the big, hairy, audacious goal in your eyes, and that's okay.
I'm going to push you a little bit harder on this one then. So being influenced is obviously a symptom of our environment. And it's interesting because like we talk about the power of a good coach is to influence.
Yeah.
But again, it's something I'm always really, really wary of and cautious of when I talk about all of these different ideas, is that we don't exist in this vacuum where we're just being pulled by good ideas. In fact, there's a lot of bad ideas and a lot of bad information and a lot of bad motivation out there that we have to navigate as well. And you mentioned that those 8 people a day starting to recognize some of the areas you didn't want. And there's a kind of a route you can take through life where if you avoid most of those things, you're probably going to do okay, even if you don't figure out the golden route or whatever it might be. But being pulled by your environment and being influenced by other people is one thing. But do you have any thoughts on why we let that override what is a deeper feeling for us, and why we struggle to really connect with our own core values unless we've been shown, or unless we've had what I refer to as this idea of the heart attack or the dark night of the soul, or something catastrophic has forced us to really have a deep, dark look at it. Why do you think it's so difficult for us?
So I know that your listeners are going to be aware of what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it just to frame what I'm about to say. So we know that natural selection has inbuilt in us this idea that we don't want to be outside of the tribe, right? So for survival, we need to try and ultimately do what the masses do, right? Social proof, very common. I was just looking at something this morning there where results was showing that 75% of us will do something even if we know that it's not the right thing to do in order to fit in with the group.
That's a TikTok study, was it?
No, this was actually a LinkedIn researcher. I can't get the researcher, but it was research backed, but it was literally something I scanned before I came in here as I was waiting for you to come and open the door for me.
You were 15 minutes early, Mark. Okay.
So ultimately, we generally at times will tend to do things that, even deep down in our gut, they're probably telling us this isn't the right move. This isn't the right direction.
This tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. Because we want to fit in with everybody else. So I do think there's I know there is a natural inbuilt mechanism which pushes us in that direction. The same way we have a negativity bias. We scan for threats more than we seek rewards, right? I think it's having an awareness of that, knowing and understanding that that's going to be trying to influence my own behavior, but also knowing that I have a choice. I have a choice in the matter, right? I can choose whether ultimately I want to follow the crowd. I want to do what I think looks good, even if I know that it's not right for me. Or do I actually take that step back? Do I reflect on, am I happy in my life? Do I feel like I always use this phrase in my own head, right? And I always ask myself, are you winning? Are you winning, Mark? Are you winning? Now that's different for everybody. I'm really clear on what winning is for me, right? So I catch myself, are you winning today? No, do you know what? I've worked for 11 hours today on something which is completely not relevant. I've fallen into the trap today. Chalk that one down. Tomorrow, I try and get back at it. I try and go again. So in a way, and I suppose people sometimes maybe roll their eyes when they constantly hear this word, but this ability to reflect regularly, to build a level of self-awareness. It was said on your last podcast with Brian, self-awareness is critical. Self-awareness is key. It is, but it's also practical. It's something that you can do every day.
It's a skill.
And it has to be something that you do every day, because otherwise something else is going to dictate the direction that you're moving in.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely frame there you've shared. It's really important for me sometimes to make sure that these conversationals come across as non-judgmental too, because this is human biology, and this was something that came up a lot in the Brian episode as well. These are natural drivers and triggers that just don't serve us as well in our modern environment anymore, in the way that society is structured now. We're not served well by this, and there's no shame in that, but understanding them, so having the knowledge and then being aware of where they're operating. So they're two different things. The knowledge is one thing. I had loads of knowledge and no awareness. Like that was me to it, and I'm only now developing the awareness to match the knowledge. So I could say the things and was completely blind to where they were showing up in my life. So it sounded, God, geez, he has all the answers there. No idea where they were showing up in my life. So the awareness piece is big for me as well. But these are human, I won't say fallibilities, but these are human principles of biology. And
like in your last episode, Brian talked about.
Brian's got a load of shout outs in this now.
It's relevant for this. He talked about the SCARF model, right? By Dr. David Rock, right? Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, built-in psychological needs, right? So you think about, why do we go in the wrong direction? Why do we follow the crowd, right? Certainty.
Yeah.
It might not be the right direction, but I'm with the group. Status, right? Relatedness.
Yeah.
It's very easy for us to make the wrong decision based on some of what we have inbuilt in ourselves, that some of these needs we're trying to fulfill. But ultimately, we far more agency in the decision-making process. But in order to have that agency, we do need to create structures in our day in order to be able to fully engage with that level of agency. the challenge for most of us is we have a biology which ultimately hasn't kept up with technology. And we go from day to day being always on in some way, shape, or form. So how much time am I carving out in my day to really take hold of that agency that I have? And, again, some people say, I can't do those things. I'm too busy. I'd love to be able to do those things. I believe you just don't have a choice in the matter. You have to actively carve out time to do those things. Now, how do I do that in my life? I'm very aware of what I like to call the third level consequences of my actions. So if I decide today not to exercise, there's a first level consequence to that. I'm not going to have maybe the energy that I would like.
Today.
There's a second level consequence to that. Maybe if I miss my workout today, I'm more likely to miss it tomorrow. What's the third level consequence? If I consistently miss my workouts, my health is going to suffer. And there's probably even deeper consequences, right?
My health suffers, my relationship could suffer, etc., etc.
Exactly. So when I'm working with somebody, I don't shy away from getting them to explore the best case scenario, the worst case scenario. Let's sit in the worst case scenario. Let's see what that feels like. Let's talk through that. Visualization is something I would use a lot with coaching clients. I want you to visualize worst case scenario. I'll give you a quick example. I would work with a lot of people at the mid-level of their career. They're in that leadership pipeline, right? And there's the fear of, can I make that step up? Will I just stay where I am now, right? What happens if I make that step up and I'm a complete disaster? I get them to walk that path. I say, I want you to walk that path. You go into that role, you're a complete disaster. What's the consequence? I lose my job, right? You lose your job. What would you do then? I'd probably, be upset for a while, probably impact my confidence. But then eventually, I'd start to map a way forward. Right. So even if the worst thing happens, you feel like you can overcome it and you can move forward. Brilliant. Right, now let's talk about if you move into that role, what does good look like? What do you need to work on? And now let's talk about when you do work on that and you're effective at that, what's life like now? How do you feel now? Okay, brilliant. So sometimes you've got to really dig into the worst case scenario. And we always again, we talk about this as business owners. We know that whether your business is a success or my business is a success, I've learned a hell of a lot of lessons, right? I also don't attach as much of my identity to my business as I once did. So will I be able to overcome it? Will it impact my self-belief if it wasn't a success? Slightly, maybe, but not as much as it would have in the early days. So I've looked in that room and I'm okay with that. And I think we have to be willing to do a little bit of that.
There's so much in there. I'm trying to hold on to a couple of key points here. That really, really great frame there. You mentioned a couple of important points that helped me put a few puzzle pieces together. The influence piece. You framing my relationship with, say, my coach as me giving you the information to help me can also be superimposed over the influence we feel in the world by other people's thoughts, opinions, marketing, whatever. If I'm giving all of these different influences power over me, they will influence me. For example, I talk about social media and the phone a lot, content we consume. If I abdicate my agency and give these tools the ability to impact and affect me, they're going to influence me. And it's not going to be necessarily in the direction of my winning.
Yeah.
If I don't know what that winning is, then I'm definitely going to be outsourcing it. I'm definitely going to be looking for that. And we have the fastest, most invasive directory of what you should be and how you should live right in our hands right now. All of these different sources of media online. So if I haven't figured out what winning is for me, it's going to be inevitable that I'm going to give away my agency. It's going to be the same relationship. I am going to communicate to these tools that I don't know what's best for me, so tell me what's best for me, and then I'm going to live my life based off that. And again, I'm probably going to feel some friction and resistance there because they're probably not aligned with me. So I think that's that's helped me paint a really nice image of when I'm interfacing or interacting with all these different tools and media and people. It's so important for me to have a grounding in what's actually important to me. And a lot of people know this. They know, like, figure out what you want because it doesn't matter what people think. But that's a really nice, practical way of looking at it. If I haven't figured that out, my natural inclination is going to be to look for it somewhere. And I'm going to give the power to anything that comes into the room. It's going to have more power over me, which I'm going to resent and I'm not going to feel comfortable doing. But I don't want to speak up against that because I'm not quite sure who I am myself. It's very hard to be the person to stick your head above the parapet if you're not fully sure of what you're doing or why you're saying it. And I don't mean sure in the methodology or how I'm going to do it, but if I'm not able to stand behind why I'm doing it. So, for example, I'll use my business. A lot of the strategy of my business is still to be determined, but I know why I want to do it. And I'm getting much more clear about that. And that makes the strategy stuff a lot easier for me. And it makes it a lot easier for me to build a barrier and a shield against a lot of the noise coming in from a lot of other sources as well. So I just really like how you put all that together. And I think the second piece when you're speaking that it was really evident. I have it on the page here. We talked about this as well. It was such an interesting way of looking at it. This idea of coaching in whatever format you want to look at it in versus therapy, because you spoke a lot about reflection.
Yeah.
And this idea of therapy, and they're both different tools and both have really important roles to play, but therapy is more about looking backwards and potentially dealing with some of those deeper emotional issues or trying to understand and resolve some of those issues. Whereas what I love about this idea of coaching in whatever format you're engaging with it in is it's mostly about reflecting in order to move forwards, in order to take action, to live your life, to develop in a certain direction. And again, not necessarily business, but to take forward steps because you've taken some time to reflect. And it's putting those pieces together. Yeah, I like that distinction.
No, you're right. And maybe just to add to that briefly. So that's not to say that a coach won't help you and challenge you on things you've carried with you, right? So for any listeners interested in this area, an individual called Antonio Damasio has done a lot of work around what we call our autobiographical self, right? So we have our core consciousness. This is what's happening right now in front of us. But we also have what's called an extended consciousness, which is essentially our ability to anticipate the future and our ability to reflect on the past. And our autobiographical self really is this, let's say, inbuilt mechanism where I'm regularly reflecting on what's happened to me in the past. I'm regularly anticipating the future. And then that's ultimately dictating how I'm making certain decisions in the present, right? But just to this point, if I've had something that's happened to me in my past, which leaves me with, let's say, a statement or a limiting belief, which is, let's say I gave a presentation when I was in school and it went horrifically wrong. And now I tell myself I am a horrific public speaker. It fills me with tons of anxiety, tons of overwhelm. What a coach can do, a coach isn't going to bring you back into the room, right? And talk about the environment of when you were given the presentation. But a coach could ask you, is that based on fact, that you're a terrible public speaker? Oh, I'm just a terrible public speaker. But is it based on fact or is it based on emotion? Talk to me a little bit. What is factual about that statement? Do you practice public speaking? No. So how could you be a good public speaker? A good coach can take a statement which is holding you back in a certain area of your life and not necessarily resolve the trauma of that experience, but they can help you shift the belief or shift the statement that's holding you back.
Do you find any friction between those two worlds? People who work in the therapeutic space and people who work in the coaching space, is there friction there? Because it seems like if it's not interpreted properly, it could, and it doesn't sound like this, by the way, but it could be interpreted in certain circles as you're just trying to bury and ignore the emotion in terms of to try and make progressions in the practical world or the real quote unquote world or the business world, whatever it might be. It could be interpreted that way. That's not what it is. But is there friction there?
I think there's naturally friction because am I going to go to the coach? Am I going to go to the psychologist, right? I've worked with clients who have a psychologist. So they go to the psychologist, they come to me for their coaching. We've said it before, again, you've said it today, like if you're going to therapy, it's unpacking some of that trauma. If you're going to coaching, it's helping you map a way forward in a certain area of your life. I certainly wouldn't be recommending, if someone has serious trauma that's unresolved, that the answer is to go and do coaching, right? I think coaching could be helpful as part of the journey, right? But there's a place for therapy, there's a place for coaching. And yes, there can be things that have happened to you in the past which are going to impact your ability to move forward. That's where a really good coach, like again, if we're talking about, let's say, a topic like self-belief, right? And what's impacting the ability of the individual to go to a leadership level is self-belief. And as you unpack that as a coach, you start to understand this person is always bringing back up, something that happened in their childhood or something and you just know, and again, for want of better words, I always say, as a coach, you need to be very aware that if you turn on a tap that you can't turn off, you're going to be in a serious position. Know your boundaries as a coach, know what your focus is as a coach, and be able to say, okay, so I would work with psychologists who in the odd occurrence, would have a client, and I would say to the client, do you know what I think would be beneficial potentially for you is to have a conversation, meet this person. I'll tell them exactly what they do because I always tell them the difference between coaching and therapy. And on a rare occasion, there might be somebody where I'm like, ethically, this is not my skill set. I am not trained to do this. And that's when I will direct them. And I think as long as we operate and we practice in coaching and obviously in therapy, from that standpoint, I think we reduce the friction.
I'm thinking of a parallel example. If we take physical health and you have nutrition and you have exercise, they can't be separated in the person, in the individual, because they're all just part of what make us a human being. But a nutritionist is not necessarily an expert in exercise, and an exercise practitioner or coach or PT is not necessarily an expert in nutrition. Now, you can obviously cross over, and there's nuance to it, but similar enough here. I think they work hand in hand. And I think what makes it a little bit more difficult to understand, and I'll speak from my experience in the physio world. I trained as an athletic therapist, so it was sports-based physiotherapy. And in that space, you have physical therapy, physiotherapy, athletic therapy, massage therapy, sports therapy, rehab therapy. You have all these different therapies. And to the layperson, it's all the same thing. But there could be the difference between somebody with 10 years of experience and 2 masters in a speciality in musculoskeletal injuries and someone who did a course at a weekend. No disrespect to either, but they're not the same thing. But depending on who you are, what you need, and how you interface, there's going to be something that suits you specifically, but they're probably not going to cover all bases. So there's probably another element to that depending on what your needs are. Similar with coaching and therapy. Yeah. I find what makes it difficult to understand this space for some people, one is what we discussed at the start, is a lack of clarity around the term coach. Is it sport? Is it like, what is a coach? Is it just business and numbers and or is it what we've just spent the last 40 minutes discussing? And then we have this bracket of life coaching, which for me has massive pros and massive cons because it blurs that line between expertise, experience, and formal qualification, understanding the human condition, whether it's therapy or coaching, and this blend of, well, I have personal experience and therefore I'm going to speak to you, but I'm going to press on all of these areas. I'm going to talk about your deep trauma and your emotional regulation and your practical tools going forward, and I'm going to package it all as life coaching. And that can also be misleading and dangerous in some cases. And as the consumers, we don't necessarily know the difference between all these different things. So that can be a confusing space, and it can blur these lines between therapy and coaching and what might be more appropriate or how they work together or if there's resistance there. That'd be a fair comment.
It would. And, if we think about how we make decisions, right, there's this aspect called the ladder of inference, right? So we've all this available data. Then there's certain data that we decide to select. And then based on that data that we select, which is driven by some of our biases, we'll derive certain assumptions, beliefs, and then we'll take actions based on them, right? The reason I'm saying that is if you're going to any practitioner, coach, etc., you've got to be careful about what data you're selecting that's driving your decisions. So obviously in this scenario, you would look at the coach's profile, previous clients they've worked with. There's a pathway for coaches done through the ICF, which is the International Coaching Federation. And there's what we call 3 main levels: ACC, PCC, and then MCC. If you're being coached by someone at ACC level, they've done, I think, roughly 400 to 500 hours of coaching, right? PCC is over 1,000 hours of coaching. And then MCC, I'm a bit away from that at the moment, so I'm not even considering that, right? But I'm currently going through the PCC process to get qualified, right? So credentials, like in any space, they're there in coaching. And if you are engaging with a coach who has not got those credentials, that's, for me, that would be something to be conscious about. Mm-hmm. I would say that's a little red flag for me, right? Because what that's telling you is they don't see the relevance in getting somebody else to evaluate their practice. And no matter what you do, it's critically important that you are willing to get somebody, your body within your area, to evaluate your level of practice. Because you're right, Dan, there's coaches and physios and who maybe aren't coming at it from the ethical and the moral perspective of, I want the best thing for this client and I want to provide the best service for this client. Some of them do see it as, but generally I find, I don't know what you think, I find those people don't necessarily last very long in this space.
That actually segues lovely to my parallel point. I am also careful of authority bias, because it is another form of bias, and I don't want to go on too much about bias. I spoke about it a lot recently, but there are many people who have the qualifications, and we can discuss this as well. We talked about this before, who could be put into the bracket of lazy in terms of how they apply. That they have the qualification, therefore they don't need to think too much about the application. And there are people I've met who don't necessarily, in many spaces, have the qualification, the formal qualification, but have a wealth of experience that's quantifiable and measurable. And that's also a really important metric for me too, because the human race we are developing, we've made all of this up, the MCC and the ACC and the 1, 2, 3 and the ABCs. We've made it all up. We've created these structures which have massive merit and are really important for society. Please let me get that part out. So I'm not saying we shouldn't trust in those formal structures at all, but there's also more. And I think our skills, to develop our skills of critical appraisal, if we can look at a coach, and if they have the qualifications, that's definitely a big tick in the right box. But it's not the only tick in the box.
No.
And also, it doesn't disqualify everybody else. However, most likely, like you said, the chances are if somebody has gone through a process, they're probably going to be the type of person that you can at least engage with initially and feel out a little bit.
Yeah.
And also then if you have a referral for somebody and other people in a similar situation to you have had good experiences, these are all different criteria, I suppose, you can have on your form. I just want to be very clear about that as well, because that's how I would approach most things. I've met people before and I've worked with people before who have very little in terms of formal qualification, but massive practical experience and lots of social proof that I trusted.
Yeah, and I think I did mention that before I went into the...
You did, yeah.
Ultimately, you are going to have different criteria, different data you're going to seek. And you're right. Profile, clients they've worked with, qualifications they might have. And at the end of it all, you're probably going to do some form of discovery or an initial consultation.
100%.
That's going to probably tell you, a lot about what the service could potentially be like.
Absolutely, yeah. And all of that is to say, that's an empowering thing to know that you can do this, go through this process and decide. Very empowering for you. But the only way you'll really know is, again, if you figured out what winning is for you. It's like, what am I actually looking for here? That's how can I tell if Mark is a good coach or a bad coach? If I don't actually know what I'm looking for out of this, am I just going in and saying, here, fix me. There's something wrong, fix me. And there was one last piece before we move on that you had mentioned previously there that made me think of Jocko Willink randomly in this situation, this whole idea of discipline equals freedom. And it was when you were talking about we have to have structures in place to support this. This is not something for most of us, because of the challenges we mentioned before of our biology and our psychology in the modern world. These are not things that come naturally, quote unquote, to lots of us. We have to put things in place to support ourselves.
Yeah.
As much as we can get support from external sources, we have to put these things in place ourselves if we want to figure out what makes us happy, if we want to achieve success in certain places. Like, that's a big if there. If you don't, keep going. Do whatever you want to do. But if you want to change something, there is certain structures you have to put in place. And this idea of discipline equals freedom, I think it encapsulates what I have felt as resistance, and a lot of people I speak to feel as resistance when we hear, I have to reflect, I have to potentially work with a coach, I have to formalize some practice. Everyone's like, oh, for fuck's sake, I've no time, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stressed. And the people who could benefit the most are probably the people who are feeling most overwhelmed or potentially burnt out or stressed. It's very difficult to, in that stress state, envision adding more to your plate, which is what this feels like. I have to put in time to do my reflection and time to sit down and write and time to engage with a coach. But it is on the other side of that, I have found you feel more of a sense of freedom and more of a sense of peace, because you put the structures in place that support you. And I always used to, it was Conor O'Keefe said it to me years ago. He's like, I have the runners beside the bed, so when I get up, it's easy to go running. Like, that's so simple. But he's just putting a structure in place to help him achieve something he's struggling to do. And it's helping. And it's very simple. So it is doing something, but it's actually going to facilitate you having a bit more space on the far side, in my experience.
Have you ever heard of the Stockdale paradox?
I don't think so, no.
So the Stockdale paradox is basically, never confuse the faith that you will get there in the end, which we ultimately need, with the discipline to assess your current state of reality. So you can't lose faith on where you want to get to, right? But you also cannot avoid regularly the discipline of regularly assessing what is the current state of play. Are my daily behaviors, are my daily structures really going to get me to where I want to go? Because I might tell myself I'm going to get there. Of course I am, but actually that has to be matched with, is what I'm doing going to get me there, and regularly assessing that.
Do you know why I love that? This is why it's so important to have people who can actually check the bro science, because that is this idea I've had, and a lot of people talk about this idea of manifestation, right? / visualization. I think they're fantastic, only when paired with a realistic plan of action. So there is a space where it's all about the manifestation. You believe and you will achieve. And then there's a space where it's all about action. Just put your nose to the grindstone and keep going, and you will get there. And I think both of those are fundamentally flawed. And I think where they both work is when they come together. And what you've just, that paradox there, the Stockdale paradox, perfect. Have the belief and the power and the vision, and you are going to get this. But regularly understand that you are a flawed human being and you need the barriers up sometimes, and you need to go, well, am I actually making decisions every day that are bringing me close to this? Because it's not enough just to think that this is going to happen because I wish it to happen or I will it to happen. I've never heard of that. That is brilliant. Was it the Stockdale paradox?
Yeah.
Watch me repeat this now for the next 20 episodes of the podcast. Is that a fair assessment of what that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to marry the two of them.
Yeah. They have to come together.
Yeah.
That is beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing. Even if we get nothing else out of the podcast, that's gold for me. That's genius. Okay, so that's a really, really nice outline of what coaching is, what it can look like, how we can interface with it, how we can most effectively get the most out of it, what we're bringing to the table. Can you talk to me then about some of the more common challenges you would have found? A lot of your work is with business owners, leadership people in that space, but what are some of the human things that come up really regularly for you that kind of you've seen patterns in your work?
So I'm going to look at this from two angles, right? The first angle is going to be, let's say, an inner aspect, right? And what I mean by that is, one thing that comes up a lot with clients that I would work with is this idea of self-belief. I'm getting pushed outside my comfort zone. The inner critic starts to really get in my ear. I'm questioning myself. I'm questioning my ability. And how do I deal with that? How do I manage that? Now, first of all, we have to call that out as something which is normal, valid. You've this idea of eliminating self-doubt. I don't believe it exists. I think if anything for you is a step outside your comfort zone, a challenge, you're going to have that uncomfortable feeling. And that's going to manifest in a thought process, which is probably going to sound a little bit negative initially, right? Negativity bias creeping back in there. But we obviously can work through that. But what attaches to that for me is this idea of this hyper-aroused state that we're constantly in, right? So if we marry the two of them for a second, right? So imagine I'm now taking on this new role and I doubt my ability and I'm in this hyper-aroused state. How's that going to really play out? Am I going to head into that role day one and be nice and calm and relaxed? No, all of a sudden the volume is turned way up on that. So any small error I make, I'm going to make that into something much bigger in my own mind, right? When we look at the research around self-belief, there's 4 ways that we can build self-belief, right? And this comes from Albert Bandura. The first one is mastery experiences, which is very obvious. If I do something well, chances are I'm going to get an increase in confidence from doing that thing again. The second one is around ultimately peers, right? So I look at a peer, I look at Dan. Dan's in my team. Dan steps up. He does it successfully. I'm very like Dan. I can actually achieve that. I could do that. So this idea of kind of role modeling, right? That's really important for building our self-belief. The other one is having good mentors, people that give us recognition, what we might call social persuasion. And this explains why if I'm working in a company and I don't get that from my manager, I'm questioning my self-belief, right? I'm questioning the value that I'm bringing. So again, for any managers listening in, one of the best things you can do to motivate your staff is recognize the good work that they do, right? That is going to work wonders for them. But the fourth one, and the important one for us in this scenario, is our ability to manage what we call our physiological and emotional states. So that's the fourth one of the 4 that Bandura identified. So managing the physiological and emotional states. So what does that mean? That essentially is managing our emotions, managing our stress, managing the levels of anxiety that we experience. So they're normal, but am I proactive in how I manage them? Because if I'm not proactive in how I manage those physiological and emotional states, if I don't have, let's say, a strategy on how I manage those moments, those high pressurized moments, those moments will continue to get the better of me. So you asked, like, what's something that comes up quite regularly with clients? What comes up quite regularly with clients is, let's say, they're surprised when I tell them that in order for them to build their self-belief, they have to get really good at managing things like their emotions, managing how they interact with stressful situations. Because it's in those moments where ultimately your self-belief can be dampened the most, but often you don't even realize it. So those 4 things, really important. The fourth one, critically important. And you'll see it. You'll see people who are really effective in high pressurized situations. You'll see how they react in those situations. They all, like, for example, and I know we're not talking any politics, right? And I'm not, by the way, I'm certainly not espousing any views of any parties. But when you listen to Catherine Connolly speak, even when she's put under pressure, excellent, calm, collected. Even when she's being challenged, right? So what's that portraying to the public? It's portraying confidence. It's portraying trust. She's able to manage her physiological and emotional states in highly pressurized situations. Now, whether that makes her a fantastic president is yet to be seen. But in those environments,
makes her a good politician.
She's showcasing that and by the way, some of our politicians are not great at managing their physiological and emotional responses, right? And we have mirror neurons. So when somebody acts in a certain way, we pick that up.
And it can elevate and escalate. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's one thing that comes up. That ability in those moments to, let's say, remain calm under pressure. That is a skill. That is something that needs to be worked at. And when we look at the 4 stages of skills, we ideally want to go from, let's say, unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. If you're not working on that skill with somebody, let's say, like me or somebody else, how are you getting better? You're learning on the job. Right. Is that an effective strategy to get to where you want to go? I would challenge that.
What does it look like to learn how to manage your emotional state?
So learning to manage your emotional state, you've got to look at your day-to-day behaviors. And I know you've talked about these things and people will know these things, but it's fundamentals. It's things like your sleep. It's things like whether you exercise or not. It's things like what your nutrition looks like, right? But then when you're with me, once we've got those fundamentals out of the way, because they are critically important, right? Then it looks like, okay, Dan, talk to me about what situations when you're in them, that they trigger you. You struggle to regulate your emotions in those situations. And let me give you an example. Somebody will say to me, having difficult conversations. I've got to do a performance review. This person's not getting their bonus. All of a sudden, I'm anxious going into this. If they take it a certain direction, maybe I react in a certain way, I'm going to regret how I've reacted in that situation. So what do we do? Yes, we do elements of visualization. I want you to put yourself in best case scenario, worst case scenario, as we described beforehand. But we also look at effective frameworks that we can practice to have difficult conversations. So I'm not rocking in to the conversation hoping it goes a certain way. I'm going into the conversation knowing this is my framework for the difficult conversation. These are the tools that I'm going to lean on. And I've also run myself through this situation time and time again. And people will say, but you can't always predict every situation, Mark. I say, no, you can't. But you can probably practice for most situations. You can visualize most situations. You can utilize frameworks in practice for most situations when it comes to a difficult conversation.
How would you stop yourself falling into the spiral of rumination? If you are somebody, you mentioned public speaking before, say the difficult situation for you to manage your emotions is public speaking because you had a bad experience and you're sitting thinking about this next presentation you have to do. How do you develop the skill of positive, productive visualization that's going to reinforce the positive neural pathways and not falling into that negative rumination? And I'm speaking from personal experience here. When sometimes I start thinking about challenging moments that are going to come up, I get consumed by, oh my God, but if this happens, and you find yourself going off in a spiral. And why you sat down to think about it was to prepare yourself psychologically for it. And the other reason I asked that question is because there is a maybe misinterpreted thought process that people will discuss in the wellness space, I suppose, of living in the now. And if you're thinking too much about the future and what's going to happen in the future, you're pulling yourself out of the now. I don't necessarily subscribe to that because I think a certain level of preparation is important. But how do you navigate that world? How do you walk that line without falling into some of these traps?
Yeah, so there's probably 2 elements to this, right? And I might address the kind of the latter first and then go back. So I did research with CEOs where I interviewed them around leadership styles, right? Basically, long story short, we know what leadership styles are beneficial for followers. There's lots of research on that. But we don't know how those leadership styles impact the leaders themselves. And I was very curious about that, right? But I remember in one interview, one of the CEOs said to me of a global company, but have a headquarter here in Ireland. And he said to me that one of his key skills is that whatever his next engagement is, no matter where he's come from, if he has a horrific meeting, if I'm meeting Dan now at 1 o'clock and it's 12:55 and I'm about to leave this room, my full focus is on Dan and what the outcome of our interaction is meant to be. So it's that ability I think is critically important, to your point, to be able to zone in and say, if I'm sitting here doing this podcast with Dan, all other elements of my life are not necessarily going to come into this room, right? I understand your point around preparation, and I would agree. You've got to be, so like this morning, I was sitting, I was visualizing, I was preparing for this engagement. But that was focused time on specifically that, right? So I was in the now, but I was also obviously thinking about this. To go back to the first piece that you mentioned, the public speaking. One of my favorite quotes is from William James, psychologist. He says, it's easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking than it is to think yourself into a new way of acting. So if I'm working with the person who's public speaking, am I going to just talk them through the limiting beliefs, get them to realize it's emotional, it's not rational? Am I just going to do that with that person? No. What am I going to do?
Get them to practice, to act it out, to potentially stand up and present, to work in front of the mirror, to speak to somebody and deliver their speech ahead of time.
100%, right? So there's the practical element and there's the psychological element. There's the behavior and there's the psychology behind it. I think both, obviously, are important, but remember the quote, it's easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking. So if I am regularly, even in my bedroom, standing up, speaking, practicing, I have, and do you know what's, and again, I must kind of mention that I deliver a lot of workshops on storytelling, right? On presenting. So this is also an area that not only do I coach people around maybe the fear of standing up, I also coach them on what a good presentation looks like, right? And what's interesting is the amount of individuals that you will see that will say that they're nervous speaking in public. And you see them rock up on stage and they have a sheet in front of them and they've got 1,000 words that they're going to say now. No wonder they're nervous. They're saying to themselves, I'm not going to trip up on any word. I'm going to look down. So first of all, looking down at a sheet does not make a good presentation, right? The presentation's for the audience. You've got to engage with the audience, right? But when they're looking down at the sheet, all of a sudden, it's the anxiety building up for them. They're not also getting cues from the audience. So in their mind, they could be thinking, this is going horrific. They could look out and they could see everyone smiling, right? So there's always a practical element. So I've gone a little off track, but just to bring it back, there's a practical element of, if I'm a public speaker and I think I'm a terrible public speaker, you got to break that down. Why have you got that thought process? Talk to me about that. But then let's not shy away from the fact that there's a practical element. Okay, now let's look at what a good presentation looks like. And now let's get you good at that. Because that's going to build your confidence. And when you build your confidence over here, it's going to reinforce this psychological aspect of you telling yourself you're not a good public speaker. Mastery experiences. It goes back to self-belief. The more I do it effectively. And there's also a caveat with that. You've got to take a non-judgmental approach. Every time I present, I do what's called an after-action review. What was meant to happen, what actually happened, what was the difference, and what did I learn? So I'll visualize what I want to happen, right? But then afterwards, I've got to go back and go, what actually happened? What was the gap? And based on that gap, what have I learned to move forward? Now I'm a better presenter. What I can't do is go, Mark, you tripped up on that line. You thought people were going to laugh. You delivered it at the wrong time. My God, you're a terrible presenter. That's not going to make me better.
Yeah.
But that's our natural reaction. So sometimes even knowing that, that's my default. Again, natural selection, evolution, right? But there's processes where we can put in place to get in the way of that, to stop us doing some of those, self-defeating processes, let's say.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how it links in so nicely with our biology. I think it was Huberman a few years ago popularized this idea of you can't think your way out of a thinking problem, and this is another addition to that. You can't think your way out of an acting problem as well. And I think the core point is the same, is that we can't trust our brain if there's a problem we're trying to solve in our brain and we just try and think our way around that problem, we're going to create these constant spirals and loops of thoughts because there's endless possibilities. And because of our negativity bias, the chances are we're going to lean into those more negative ones, which are going to create a negative physiological response. Point number 4, that negative physiological response is going to further disimprove our thought process. We're not going to be thinking logically, et cetera, et cetera. Big spiral there. And simply by acting, and even from the Huberman side of things, if you're struggling with that problem, going for the walk could be that action. But if it's a specific problem, acting out the specific action in a safe, controlled environment is also going to help downregulate the biology. It's going to reinforce the positive patterns. It's going to be literally practice. So you have the confidence comes from competence comes from practice, that whole piece as well. So there's so many positives that can be directly linked with how we operate as human beings.
And can I add something just to that as well, just on top of what you just said?
No.
I think it's important for us to remember that every action, every behavior that we do is goal-directed, right? And people might go, what? I pick up my phone, that's not goal-directed. Of course it's goal-directed. You just are less clear on what the goal is. And the goal is probably distraction, right? Every action and behavior we do is goal-directed. What I've tried to work on myself, because I've struggled with this, is in situations, be really honest about what the goal is. I'll give you an example. Like everyone, I'm sure listening to this, I have a couple of things going on in my own life at the moment. And funny enough, when I lie my head down on the pillow at night, that's when they seem to want to kind of jump up and really kind of come into play. What I've really tried to work at is be really clear on what the goal is. When I'm lying in bed, the goal is not to think about those things. The goal is to try and get some rest. So even if I don't fall asleep because these things pop in and out, the goal is to get some rest and get some recovery. That's the goal of sleep. It's not the time to be thinking about all of these different things that are going on in my mind. I will carve out time to do that tomorrow. Now, again, that's not a foolproof strategy, right? Some nights it's easier than others. And by the way, some nights it gets me to sleep and then I'm awake at 3:00, right? But again, I'm trying to bring it back to what's the goal of the action or the behavior. And to your point, Dan, I think that can be very helpful for people, is go back to the idea that, and realize every action, it's goal directed. What's the goal in this situation? Because for example, if I'm the public speaker and let's say I don't deliver a good presentation, what's the ultimate goal? The goal is to get better as a public speaker. So today is not my day. I struck out today. But what can I learn to bring forward? Because the ultimate goal is I want to get better at public speaking.
And if you really want to break it down, if it didn't go well today, that's also going to bring you closer to the goal of being a better public speaker because it's more information.
Yeah.
If you're willing to be open to the information, it's more information. And again, I think that's where the resistance comes in again. I don't want that bad information. I just want it to work. I don't want the uncomfortable process of having to acknowledge that it didn't go well and it didn't go well because it was my fault. And that doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but I can't unlink those connections in my brain. It didn't go wrong because I'm a bad person, because I haven't taken the time to actually tease it out. It's not because I'm a bad person. Maybe I didn't prepare. Maybe I didn't sleep well. Maybe I misunderstood the context of what the talk was meant to be, whatever it might be. The gap between acknowledging and understanding those practical points that I can work on going forward and me where I am right now is that emotional discomfort. It is that emotional discomfort that I have to sit and actually analyze this. And I know I shared with you during our coaching sessions as well. It's interesting looking back at how uncomfortable I've always been with being assessed. It's not important for me to understand really why or where that came from. I don't remember a specific traumatic experience. But now that I know that, I can look forward and see if I'm going to stand up and be a public speaker, I'm going to be assessed on my ability to communicate an idea. If I allow this discomfort to infiltrate that, I'm never going to achieve this goal that I say I want, which is to stand up on stage. So I have to be okay acknowledging that I'm uncomfortable with this and then build strategies around it. I don't necessarily have to dive right down into the trauma, although that could be helpful as well. I could do that separately. But until I do that, I'm not going to achieve the goal.
And can I ask you, what have you done there? So what have you done in that process?
Develop some self-awareness.
Yeah, but what have you done specifically in that? As in, I'm asking you, let's say, what is the outcome of what you've done?
I'll be a better public speaker. Now, I'm not. It's not
Sorry,
public speaking
yeah,
for me, but yeah,
yeah.
I'll be better at the thing I say I want to do.
Right. What you've done in that scenario, and from what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
is you now have a different set of expectations.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
Right?
I've reframed it. Yeah.
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 And that's really important. Expectations and the expectations we put on ourselves a lot of the time are very unrealistic, right? Quick example. When I used to deliver talks, my goal was knock it out of the park. Everyone in the room is going to love it, right? Completely unrealistic expectation. Now when I go into a room, I know a third of this room is going to really engage with what I want to say, probably if I do a good job. The other third are probably going to be interested, but they might,
Dip in and out. Yeah.
And there's going to be maybe a third, hopefully less, that just don't engage with it. It just doesn't connect with them. So my expectation when I go into a room now is no longer, I'm going to absolutely nail this, right? And yeah, some days I might, right? But it's much more of a realistic expectation now. What's the benefit of that to me? The benefit to me is when I go into that room, having that expectation keeps me calm, keeps me confident. I'm not trying to meet a standard. And I think there's a real, especially with social media and its prevalence now, there's a trap where we fall into unrealistic expectations. And those unrealistic expectations it's like a spiral. It's like that ladder of inference, okay? If my belief is an unrealistic expectation, well, then all of a sudden I'm being driven and I'm being directed, and the data that I focus on is all around unrealistic expectations. And I think that is something that is dangerous if not addressed and if not actively called out. Because I'm talking about public speaking, right? But like, I'm sure you can give me a ton of examples where, and you're looking at personal experience, right? And I'm mid-30s now, right? And myself and my wife, we bought a house last year, right? But it's incredible how you just go, that's just part of life. Like, that's just part of life. Like, there's a lot of people out there that are struggling to achieve that, right? But it's incredible how, even though I'm in this space, that I completely discounted the journey, the challenge. It was like, once it's done, it's done. You move on. So I suppose what I'm saying is, we are in society, it's like the next thing, the next thing,
the hedonic treadmill, yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, again, I'm calling myself out here and saying there's a scenario where, I didn't sit back, I didn't reflect, I didn't, we didn't go enough, let's say. That was a really good achievement. Well done us. We should be very proud.
I think it's a really, it's a fine balance to strike. It's a lovely point to make, because as much as it's important to sit and reflect on the things that are holding us back, it's as important, if not more important in some scenarios, to sit and reflect on the things we've done well and to harness those to move us forward. And you talked earlier on about being driven more by fear than being pulled by growth or success or that negativity bias that we have. That's potentially something that could counteract that for us, is to sit and reflect on, actually, I've done a great job here. I'm actually quite proud of myself. But I think it's hard to walk that line for people, because there's the language that's used in most spaces that I've been exposed to is to not lower your expectations because you lower your standards. And if you lower your standards, it's not going to drive you forward. And this is where we could potentially touch into that toxic mentality and the hustle culture and all that kind of stuff. This global expectation of there is a standard and we all have to meet it, and becomes our standard. And no one really knows whose standard it is, but because everybody's looking at it, it must be the standard, and it links in with everything we've spoken about. We all want to be part of this thing. We don't want to be the outsider. Yeah. So we'll all just accept this is the standard. And if you're not reaching the standard, So if you haven't got your house and you haven't got all of these different things that we're supposed to have at a certain period in your life, you haven't met the standard. But everyone's like, who's actually well,
Yeah.
did I pay we don't even ask those questions.
Definition of success goes back, what do you want?
What do you want?
Yeah.
What is winning? But I think that practice could be really, really helpful for that. Like most of us, to get to where most of us who are listening to this podcast are right now, we've all done some amazing things. We've achieved some incredible things, and we don't look at them as achievements. We look at them as by the ways, or that's just what we have to do, or we might have never thought about before. And it's just something I've particularly not been attentive to at all in my life ever, because I had such a, like I mentioned earlier on, such a phobia of being assessed even by myself. I think I mentioned this in the episode of Brian as well. Reflecting, just had this deep fear, the deep fear of assessing or analysing myself in any way, because I think I'm afraid of not measuring up to this idea of success. And if I look at it, it'll be a reality that I haven't measured up. So if I just ignore it, but that means ignoring all of the positives, all of the positive things and all of the progress that you've made and all of the experience you have and the positive memories that you have. So I think using that as one of your structures, one of your practical reflective tools, not just reflect on where you could do better and improve, but where you've done really, really well. Yeah. I think that's just as important, if not more important.
No, you're right. It's a great call out. And I think to your point there, again, highlighting how uncomfortable it can be when you're self-assessing. And
you don't even know if you're assessing yourself on the right metrics as well. So yeah.
But there's innate flaws like in all areas of our life. And like, I find it interesting that this idea, the mentality we're describing, lower your expectations, you lower your standards. I always find you've got to challenge those statements. You've got to challenge those things. Even something like if I said to you, it's good enough. People look at that and they go, they don't want to attach themselves to good enough. I want to be great. I don't want to be good enough. Do you know what? I don't mind being good enough. Why do I not mind being good enough? Because maybe to be great is going to impact other areas of my life. And I'm not willing, in order to be the best public speaker in the world, that's not worth it for me if it's going to impact the relationship I have with my wife, the time I can spend on my health, how much I can invest into my business in terms of time and energy. So I can be a good enough public speaker. And if I'm never great, I'm okay with that, because I'm clear what trying to be great might upset in other areas of my life. And what I'm saying, by the way, is more personal. It's not necessarily evidence-based, right? But I think for me, it is the key to a level of contempt that I have that I would have never had, because I was driven by be great, Mark. I find being good enough leads to a lot more happiness personally and satisfaction.
Thanks for sharing that. It's profound, I think, because the word enough is in there. That's a big word for me. I never frame it as good enough, but in most of the conversations I have, probably with men, it's not as obvious for me when I speak to women. Most of the conversations, I feel an undercurrent of not enough, and attach whatever the mission is here. And I know when we talk about, like, even when I talk about people doing podcasts, or when people come in, I'm so curious as to why do you want to do this? Because I know a lot of the reasons I made some decisions in my life around my podcast or my business or in my sporting life or whatever were driven, I now know we're driven by a feeling of less than. And that's really powerful, a really powerful motivator for people. And I've also met, and you could probably speak to this too, so many people now at this stage, hundreds, who have all of the things I thought I was supposed to have, and they're not happy. They still feel like they're not enough. And they have, to the power of 1,000 in terms of material success, what I would ever achieve. And they are not enough in their own minds. And you can feel it, and some of them say it and they express it. That's a really powerful lesson. And to hear you share that as well, I think this, if I get to the end of my life and I have still ignored that message inside myself, if I've still heard you say that and not reflected on how it's influencing me in my life, how I haven't fully defined what enough is for me and what winning is for me, because I have loosely defined it. And I feel most of us have a general feeling over here somewhere in our peripheral vision of what enough is. And most of us are very close to that, if not have it right now at this very moment. But how many of us actually turn and acknowledge, oh, wow, I'm really close to it, or I have it right now, or I'm nowhere near that, but I have all these other things. I don't know how many of us actually do that. And I think you sharing that is really powerful. And I think it should probably be a core, I don't know, mantra, part of our practice to figure out what that is. Because all of the practical tools that we've shared and discussed about, and all of the research and all of the studies and all of the coaching can only go so far, I think, if we don't have that bit figured out. How much of that do you find with other people that you deal with? How many people have what you've described there as, and I'm not saying you have it perfect, but a really good grasp on what enough is?
Very few.
Okay.
Yeah, very, very few. It's not something that is espoused in society. It is now more so, right? But I think the challenge can be when it's espoused in society, it can often be espoused by people that we look at and think, well, of course you can say that. Look where you are at now, right? But if you were where I am, I'm still battling here. I'm still fighting. And I'm still fighting. I'm still battling, right? But I think you can battle while also appreciating your achievements, what you have at the moment. I don't think there's ever an end to, this idea of greatness, right? If we take any individual who we would classify, as being great, the trait that most of them have is they're extremely selfish, right? Great sports stars, great people in business, this definition of great, right? They're extremely selfish individuals, self-obsessed, I don't want to be that kind of person. So if great really requires you to be extremely selfish in the pursuit of what you're trying to achieve, that doesn't sit right with me. So now good enough for me actually sounds more attractive than great, because great doesn't align with my values and who I am. But if good enough means that I can have all these other plates spinning effectively, yeah, I'm happy enough with good enough. So to your question, Dan, very few people, I think, sit back and they analyze that. What does it take to be great? But I'm driven by great. When actually, I would encourage my clients to consider what good enough looks like for you. And let's start working towards that. Because I can see, and I've seen many occasions where there's a shift in terms of mindset, happiness, motivation, when the expectation is far more realistic.
How is that message received if it's delivered with the type of person you work with? Because you work with a lot of people at a level. I'm not saying they're the people you described before, the great people who are super selfish, narcissistic, but there's to achieve a level of success in those environments in general, I'd imagine you would need a certain level of narcissistic tendencies. You're being driven a lot by maybe unhealthy sources of motivation rather than being drawn by this grand vision that you have, I would imagine. Correct me if I'm wrong. Does that message land?
So let's go back to something we said earlier, right? What's our success dependent on? I'm going to test you.
Oh, God. You've said so much. I'm going to go with, well, I'm going to modify the answer. Our success depends on how we define it.
Right. So it's our ability to get what's in our heart and mind.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. From practical to our ability to communicate to you how to help me best achieve the goal. And to start that, me understanding what that is.
Right. So
Yeah.
let's take the person you're describing, right? Because I've engaged with many of them, right? The myth is that I, ultimately have to show up in a certain way. And don't get me wrong, that's going to elevate you to a certain level in an organization. That person, that selfish person who just will step over anybody to get where they need to go, right? They do, unfortunately, a lot of the time end up in these C-suite level roles. But then they get there and they realize all of a sudden now my success is dependent on all of those people I've actually stood on to get where I need to go. So the message around good enough for those people is more around you're now an influencer of those people around you. You now need to connect with them. You now need to build relationships with them. So ultimately, they have to feel a level of connection to you. If you're selfish, self-obsessed, narcissistic, what kind of culture are you going to create within your organization? Are you going to have people who are going to back you, who are going to run through the brick wall for you? You might go, I'll pay them enough. Yeah, but your competitor can probably pay them as much in time. So how are you going to keep your good people? So when you're dealing with those individuals, first of all, they have to be open-minded. You can never coach someone who and I've had people, by the way, who they knew more than I did about coaching. So, as in, it's like, yeah, right. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Won't go any further than this.
I know these strategies, Mark. Come on, give me something new. Give me the new bullet. Yeah.
So you're never going to coach those people. So if I engage with someone like that, thanks very much. We'll leave it there, right?
You're never going to coach those people, or is there a coach out there for those people?
Those people cannot be coached.
They're uncoachable.
No. Okay. Now, let me give a caveat to that. There are some people who show up with that mindset and you ask them questions and you realize there's a little gap here and I can crawl in the gap. Now, how I crawl in the gap is I need to have a statement or an observation or an insight which makes them go, fuck me, I can't believe he said that to me. Sometimes you can win those people over, right? But I suppose back to your question, if they're not open-minded, there's no point. If they are open-minded, third level consequence. If you keep operating the way you're operating, I'm going to tell you, because I've seen this play out, I'm going to tell you how this is going to play out for you. And you can tell me to F off and get out of your office. But I'm confident that when I tell you how this is going to play out, you're going to want to sit down and have a bit more of a discussion on it all.
Okay.
So it works on those characters as well.
And it's back to the same principle, whether it's C-suite or the I'm not going to say the average person, but someone who doesn't work in those environments. You're making an emotional connection for this person. You're touching on something that's meaningful for them. If it's a third level consequence, if it's status, there needs to be that gap is probably an emotional.
Do you know what's interesting, right? Just because you've brought the word up.
Yeah,
there.
go on.
If I asked you to consider what makes you hesitate to do something, right? Most people would answer and say, it's a feeling, right? I might get an uneasy feeling, stepping outside my comfort zone. Oh, feels a bit uncomfortable, right? So what that tells us is that when we are making a decision, taking an action, initially it's driven by a feeling, right? If I'm trying to connect with someone, or if I have a team of people and I'm trying to get them to complete a project, or if I'm selling something to somebody, we often make the mistake of putting all the emphasis on what we call the functional job, right? This comes from Theodore Levitt, when actually what's going to make the connection or make the sale is focusing on the emotional job. Although our decisions are dictated by feelings, we often don't take that approach with people we engage with. So whether you're a manager, whether you're a salesperson, are you really trying to understand the emotional job that you're solving? So in a work context, paying you a salary is a functional job. Recognizing your good work and building your self-confidence is an emotional job. What do you do as a manager or a business owner? Do you pay a salary or do you recognize, right? If you're a salesperson, are you selling the drill for the hole in the wall, Or are you talking to the person about, what pictures are you hanging up? Family portrait, lovely. People are going to walk in and see that. Oh my God, this is definitely the drill for you. Lead with the emotional job.
I'm smiling. I'm smiling here because it's back to how humans, about storytelling, how we engage with the meaning behind something. And like in sales and stuff like that, they often talk about this. And it's funny because all of these things, I don't know why my brain always goes to the negative side as well, how that's also something that can be manipulated. If people can emotionally connect with you and make something painful for you, they have some sort of leverage over you as well. So I think awareness around that, I don't know why my brain went there straight away.
But it's interesting because we always, the whole, candle analogy, make the customer feel the pain and then they're yours.
Yeah.
I hate that, and I would never ascribe to that in how I operate. But what you want to try and do is understand for that individual, not manipulate, understand what is the positive emotional job. And I suppose the outcome of that is connection, right?
Yeah.
So that what you can achieve through that is a connection, a good quality relationship. Now, whether you abuse that relationship,
that's a moral question. Yeah,
exactly.
And I think from two perspectives, if it's the leader you're working with, you want to give them the ability to effectively lead their team or to engage with their team. But if it's me and you're teaching me these skills, it's for me to be able to lead myself sometimes. What are the emotions that I feel and how can I make something connect with me on an emotional level? I.e., I've said to Mark, I want to have the best business in the world. Or when people come in here, there's something I've done subconsciously. People come in and say, I want to do this podcast or create this piece of content. I'm like, but why? Why? Why do you want to do this? There's a lot of moving parts here. Why do you really want this? And then there's some emotional stuff in there. And if I can understand that and they can understand that, usually they start to make different decisions. Well, actually, I don't want to be the biggest podcaster in the world. To be honest with you, that'd be a nightmare to have all these people looking at you and analysing every word you say. But I have this thing I'd love to express, or have this deep curiosity, or I have this thing these people I want to connect with. I said, well, that's a different thing. And if you understand that, you have a lot more control over what you do. So I like that. So powerful tools. With great power comes great responsibility. to quote a line from Tobey Maguire in Spider-Man, if people didn't get the reference, this shows how old we are now, Mark. Because we've been 9.
He was the OG
Spider-Man. Yeah.
In our day, anyway.
Back in our day, he was the main man. I think we're going to have to do a 2-parter, if you don't mind, with this, because there's another couple of big bits I want to get into here, but I think I'm going to save them. And to bring this one home, can we potentially, it's been an incredible conversation with so much real insight around these topics. Can we build a basic toolkit for people? I know this is a really hard thing to do based off everything we said. It's very individual. But for me, what's come up in this conversation is a real emphasis on building awareness, as we said, combined with the knowledge. So the knowledge is great. And a lot of my listeners, particularly my listeners, people who listen to the show, love the personal development stuff. I love the personal development stuff, and the books and the podcasts is probably why people are listening right now. So the knowledge that you've shared is incredible. But the self-awareness piece is a skill that we can develop to make the knowledge more relevant and applicable. With that as an example, is there a toolkit that people could start to build for themselves if they're starting to feel like, okay, I want to make some moves here. I want to change some directions here. I want to figure out what winning is for me. Where would you start? Where would you advise people start in general? Because I know it's nuanced. I know it depends, obviously.
Yeah.
But is there a starting point for people?
And again, maybe if we do a part 2, we can go in more detail.
Just change that language, Mark, when we do a part 2.
Yeah. This is going to hopefully land, right? The toolkit is take some actions, right? It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to make mistakes. There's going to be failures. You're going to learn a lot. Stop thinking, take action. Whatever it is, whatever the thing is, start taking actions. So the toolkit I would like to give to people potentially for value to be beneficial is to identify some actions that you can take, reflect on those actions, our after action review that we mentioned earlier on, right? But start taking action in these areas. We've talked about a lot today. I'm sure people are going to take in some elements of that. The most important thing as we leave this call, or leave this session, is take actions. Small, medium, like start with the small actions, but take action. That might not be the toolkit you want, Dan, but I think it's what
perfect.
It goes back to the William James quote. Start taking actions. And that could be just identifying, here's where I am now, here's where I want to go, how am I going to get there? Right. Write your list of actions, your tactics, what you're going to do. Start doing, and then reflect. We overanalyze and there's inaction. Start taking actions, reflect on those actions.
I think it's perfect, Mark. I like that. I like how that's very specific to every individual. It actually ties in. I don't often pull quotes from Alex Ramosi because I find sometimes that could be problematic for some people.
Yeah.
But this is maybe a butchering, a conscious butchering of his quote. He has this idea of the answers you're looking for are in the conversations you're not having, and I'm going to add in the actions you're not taking. I think I'll speak from me here. That has been a huge shift that I'm undergoing at the moment, is taking actions despite feeling uncomfortable. Whereas I used to not take actions until I felt completely comfortable.
Yeah.
And I never felt completely comfortable, so I never took the actions. What I'm learning is as I'm taking the actions, I still feel uncomfortable. That has not gone away. So if that's a requirement for taking action, let me just share that it's probably going to stop you from taking a lot of really important actions. But what I'm actually learning is it's activating a part of my brain that feels like it's been lying unused, dusty for a long time, and I'm feeling strange and uncomfortable as I'm doing. And these are not particularly challenging things, but things I would have been putting off for unknown reasons, stories I'm telling myself, maybe belief issues. I'm now starting to be able to take action on those things. There's a part of my brain activating, and through that process of doing it and the brain activating, I'm able to sit and go, well, that's very interesting. That's quite new. And also, I've got this thing done that I've been trying to do for 3 years, but for some reason I've never done. I still feel uncomfortable, but things have now happened and I've learned things. And then the next thing that comes up, I'm a little bit less hesitant to take action on it. So I can already see, even though this is a new process for me, how in 6 months or 6 years or hopefully 6 decades, that'll just compound. And even if I still feel uncomfortable taking action in 60 years' time, I look back and all of those actions I said I wanted to take, I've taken. And the chances are, by taking all these actions, things are going to happen that are going to fundamentally shift the direction of my life. They're going to give me more information and data. So I think that's my experience of what you've just said there about the action piece.
Yeah, and you've summarized it really well. Probably better than I had said it. Maybe the last thing I would say is to your point there as well. No situation that we experience is inherently stressful. It's our perception of the situation that makes it stressful. And specifically, it's our perception that we don't have the resources in order to be able to deal with the situation. That's what creates the stress. Now, there's another thing which is called cross-stressor adaptation, which you may have heard of.
Not cross-dresser adaptation. I'm just going to clarify for a minute.
So ultimately, it means that the more that I expose myself to taking action, embracing the discomfort, the more I'm able to do it. But the same is said on the opposite. The more I resist taking the action, the more uncomfortable it becomes, the less I take action. So it comes back to this piece ultimately around, the only way we can overcome, let's say, the fact we look at the situation and we perceive it to be outside of our realm of resources, the only way we can really overcome that is by engaging with it and analysing it. If we don't engage and analyse it, if we don't take the action, we never know. So I think a nice way to finish off is to encourage people to embrace the discomfort and take action.
I love that, Mark. Absolutely fantastic there. And that's that confidence thing. I think people always think that the confidence is this inherent, built-in, genetic, organic thing that we either have or we don't have. I'm either confident or not confident. But confidence comes from competence, which comes from practice and reflection. And the more you practice and reflect, the more you become competent. And then that breeds real confidence. So again, something you can learn and something you can develop, which is just it's so good to know this, that it's not an inherent flaw with me, that I have this problem, that I don't have confidence in this area, that I'm bad at this. most of these things can be worked on, but it requires the stepping back and the reflective practice first, and then without ruminating too much about it, then being able to take action. So we're putting all the pieces together there. Mark, thank you so much for your time. I am going to bring you back. There's two big glaring out areas. I'm not going to say them, but we'll have a lot to talk about in the next episode as well. And you touched on one there. But for people who are no doubt fascinated by this, is there a process through which they can speak to you or maybe engage with you or potentially work with you?
Yeah, so you can check me out at fitvision.ie or leadersconnect.ie, is where I do a lot of my leadership work. Generally, feel free to connect in with me on LinkedIn as well. I talk about this stuff quite a lot through my LinkedIn platform as well. And I also record a podcast here in Prymal Studios with Dan, and that's called the Lead Well podcast. So you can imagine, based on today's conversation, that we touch on a lot of the topics that we talked about today.
And that's particularly interesting because a lot of the people you're speaking to are people in these positions we've been talking about. They're real life examples of people who are employing and applying the skills and skill set of coaching and leadership and mentoring. And so it's so interesting for me. Like you, when you were doing the PT, getting to meet these people, it was a huge driving force for me setting up the studio, because when you bring somebody in, I get to meet this person. I'm exposed to their mindset and again, things that are, I really respect and admire that, and things that I'm like, that's something that I would not like in my life. It's just fascinating to hear these conversations play out. So definitely, if today has piqued your interest, I would highly recommend people go and listen to some of those episodes. Mark, really appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Fascinating insights, and looking forward to round two.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, thank you so much for listening to that episode of Mark O'Reilly, and thank you so much, Mark, for your time. I've really, really been enjoying the conversations lately. The quality of conversation, the depth and the insights the guests bring to the show is just so fascinating to me. And it makes this process really, really fulfilling. And a lot of that is down to you, the listener, and down to the guests that come on and give us their time as well. So just wanted to express my gratitude for that. If you have been enjoying these episodes as much as I have, please do let me know how you feel. Drop us a comment on Spotify or YouTube, and make sure you're following along on one of these platforms and that you're subscribed so you never miss an episode and you're always updated when they go live. It also makes such a massive difference to us to know that you're enjoying what we're doing, and hearing that feedback is really, really valuable for us. So please do share if you have the time. I'm already looking forward to round two with Mark, and I will see you all in the next episode.